Everybody has that video game that has created an imprint in their childhood. For some people, it could be as far back as Pong on the Atari 2600. For others, it could be more modern game franchises such as Gears of War, Halo, or beloved RPGs such as Final Fantasy or Dragon Quest. Whatever your era, whatever your taste of game, there's always that one game that brings you a wave of nostalgic happiness when you think of it. A feeling that brings back the days when your troubles were gone as soon as you pressed the power on button, and the only responsibility you had was to play and beat that game. A lot of people will say that game for them is Final Fantasy VII. A game changer, quite literally, in the eyes of the gaming world, originally revealed to be released on the N64, and it was finally released onto the PlayStation 1 instead on a cold winter's day of January 31st, 1997. I'm not here to talk about Final Fantasy VII. I'm here to talk about its little sibling, a game released merely 2 years after, in 1999. A game known to the majority of the Final Fantasy fanbase as the black sheep of the family, but a little game that changed my life as a child. Final Fantasy VIII. I was only 11 years old in March of 2001. My parents had bought me a PlayStation for the previous Christmas, my first official console of my own. Up until that point, I had been mooching off of my brother's system when he wasn't home, sneaking in play sessions of Mario 64, Turok, or the occasional Super Mario World on the Super Nintendo. To say I was elated when I opened the PlayStation under the tree to a few PS1 games that my parents had picked out for me is an understatement. I was excited to finally have a system I didn't have to walk on eggshells to play. I finally had one of my own. The PS1 came with Celebrity Deathmatch, Shrek's Treasure Hunt, and a few sports games that had been popular at the time. I was a kid in a candy shop. I didn't waste any time hooking it up and going to town as Pamela Anderson, beating up a werewolf. We had a game store in my town called Electronic Boutiques at the time. It would later turn into EB Games and then GameStop when it got bought out by the Americans. My dad started taking me there on days he was home from his long-haul trucking, as he had always been into looking at video games with us, a trend that continues to this day. These moments were special to me, as I didn't get to see a lot of my dad at that time, and my siblings, who were a bit older, had their own lives going on and didn't want to be bothered with their annoying little sister. On this particular day in March 2001, my dad was on a break from his trucking job and decided to take me to the EB Games. It was my first time being able to really look for a game that was from my own system. We walked in and I beelined it straight for the PlayStation 1 section and started searching. Between a few cool games like Rayman or Dungeon Keeper, they were cool, but none that really caught my attention, until I walked past it. The cover caught my eye immediately. A beautiful black-haired woman standing in between two men, some sort of witch, or sorceress, as I would find out later, looming menacingly in the background. Two people hugging on the logo just above the words, and the number written in italic Roman numerals. Final Fantasy VIII. I was captivated, my greedy little hands snatching it up from the shelf. I looked at the back and read the story about a military student named Squall and his war against a powerful sorceress and time itself. I must have been practically drooling over it because my father had walked over with an amused smile on his face. He did what he always does when he wants to show interest in our hobbies. Picked up a copy, started looking it over. His brow furrowed slightly as he read the back. I looked up at him and I didn't even need to ask. He asked me, "Is this the one?" When I nodded, he waved the employee over and started asking questions about how it was number 8 in the series, worried that I would be skipping a whole generation of storylines. The employee patiently explained that each Final Fantasy has its own separate storyline, and it wasn't necessary to play one before the other. After a few moments of deliberation, my father picked up the game next to it, Final Fantasy IX, which had released just 1 year before, in 2000. He grabbed both and asked if I wanted both, to which I shrugged and said, "Why not?" We checked out and made our way home, to which my dad broke the news. I asked your mother, and she said to give you one now and save the other one for your birthday. So, pick the one you want to play first. I picked 8, of course. I couldn't wait to try it. I rushed to my room and practically shoved the disc into the PlayStation and turned on the tiny little CRT TV my father had given me to replace the one he put in his truck. And I knew from the introduction that this was my game. The CGI movie started, a flash of scenes that was overwhelming and confusing, an epic operatic score playing in the background, 2 men fighting, a beach with the subtitled words, "I'll be waiting here, so if you come here, you'll find me, I promise." It was a very confusing introduction to say the least, but it left me wanting more. I have to preface this by saying this was my first introduction into what I would discover was the role-playing genre, or JRPG as we know it today. I was also 11. I had no formal education into the turn-based world, especially since 8 was not your typical turn-based game. Final Fantasy VIII relies heavily on what is known as its magic draw system. You draw magic from monsters and allot the magic to your character's stats to help you achieve success in battles. While the game can technically be beaten without this system, you're going to have a pretty tough time. In fact, I wouldn't really figure out the draw system entirely until 12 years later, which is when I would beat the game for the first time at the age of 23. But I'll come back to that. Regardless of my complete ignorance of the battle system, I had the time of my life. To me, it wasn't about the gameplay. It was about the story, the characters. I wanted to know more about what drew all these characters together. Squall himself was a topic of controversy, even to this day. People see him as an angsty teenager, an emo wannabe Cloud, comparing him to Cloud from Final Fantasy VII, a less superior version. But to me, Squall was the most relatable character in the game. A young man who's lived far beyond his years, who has abandonment issues, isolated, loss of faith in humanity, a lone wolf who just wants to be alone so that no one else can hurt him. He pushes away those who try to break through his walls, until he meets her. Renoa is the complete opposite of Squall. Perky, loving, a little annoying and pushy, everything that Squall isn't. And it's this dynamic that created what I would consider to be one of the greatest love stories in gaming history. Along with a ragtag group of friends they meet along the way, they set out on an adventure, a political war involving seedy politicians, sorceresses from future and past, and the thing that brings them all together: hot dogs. Just kidding, it's friendship. It's corny, but it's the trope that is a lot of people's guilty pleasure. The entire theme of the whole game is how the bond of friendship can help you persist through the toughest challenges of life, how we're all tied to each other through the trials and tribulations of our pasts and our future. No character is exempt from this. Throughout the game, Squall begins to allow his defense to be broken through. He allows himself to open up more and more, finding himself begrudgingly enjoying the presence of people he considers annoying, especially Renoa. He starts to realize that he can't do everything alone, and sometimes you have to place trust in others to be able to face the future. As someone who didn't have a lot of friends growing up and was bullied quite a bit, living vicariously through this group of friends helped me realize that if there was hope for someone as damaged as Squall, maybe there was hope for me. I'm not here to talk about the inconsistencies of the plot, the theories of Squall being dead, or the criticism of the battle system. This isn't what's important to me, because when I think back to Final Fantasy VIII, I think of the stooge-like cast of characters who face time compression together to overcome everything they all feared. Each character has a mask they're hiding behind, a fear that they have to face. Squall and his innate fear of being abandoned again if he opens up his feelings. Renoa and her fear of accepting her fate as a sorceress's vessel. Irvine and his fear of never being taken seriously, the pressure of having to be the best sharpshooter in the world. Selphie and her insecurities behind her mask of being the outgoing and loving personality. Quistis and her demotion from professor to be forced to join Squall's team in a manipulation tactic by Cid to fight the sorceress. Zell and his hot dogs. They're all characters with such a range of personalities and quirks, all complete opposites, and yet they work. And that's why I adore this cast of characters so much more than a lot of Final Fantasy games I've played. Final Fantasy VIII never stood a chance against 7. 7 was such an international success that 8 never had a fighting chance, and I think that's sad. 8 has so much to offer its audience, from friendship to a brazen epic love story that spans literal timelines, and yet it's still considered the black sheep of the family. This game gave me hope that maybe one day I could also break my own walls down and allow people in, allow myself to rely on others to face my future. It was the entire game as a whole, but also certain scenes that made it the icing on the cake. The Ragnarok scene stands out the most, with Eyes on Me playing in the background as Squall and Rinoa finally open up to each other at their most vulnerable moments, knowing that Rinoa will be sealed away for the world's safety. I think that's the scene I rewatch the most. The interactions between Irvine and Selphie, the moment of vulnerability we see Quistis in after getting demoted, the scene of all of them at Trebia Gardens supporting Selphie, which is when they decide to finally beat the sorceress together. We see the characters each grow in their own ways, while still remaining true to themselves. They never ask each other to change, which is what true friendship is. One of the best moments I had with this game was when I was 23. It was summer of 2013, and I had just lost my grandmother, my last living grandma, in March. With university on the horizon in a few months and the chance to move across the country, I was facing a lot of anxieties about my life, my future. I had asked my friend to play through it with me. I wanted to share this game with her before we inevitably went our separate ways. We would get to the end in about 4 days, but it was a non-stop 4 days. A blur of laughter, frustration, and just pure fun. I would walk to her house around 2 p.m. and we'd play endlessly until 5 in the morning, to which I would drag myself back home just to do it again the next day. It was one of the best times in my life, and while we wouldn't beat it, the time I spent with her those 4 days were some of the best in my life. I think there was a part of me that never wanted to beat it, because I never wanted it to truly end. But just because something ends doesn't mean you can't enjoy it again. Which is why I decided to beat up myself the next year, which left me feeling elated, almost like a chapter had closed in my life, but one that could be reread at any time. I didn't compare this game to any other Final Fantasy, simply because I had never played one before this. I had allowed myself to play this game without knowing anything about the previous entries, and in a way, I'm glad I did. Even as an adult, I can look back on this game with happiness. It's my feel-good game. I play it whenever I feel myself starting to lose faith in humanity, just so I can be reminded why I shouldn't. This game saw me through all the trials and tribulations of my life, my grandparents passing, my constant moving across the country where I was alone, familial issues and broken hearts and broken friendships. I joined this cast of characters on their adventure, and they joined mine. I'll be forever grateful to my father for introducing me to my favorite game ever, and I'll be forever grateful to Final Fantasy VIII for being that game that brings me nothing but good feelings and memories whenever I think about it or play it. Thank you for listening, fellow viewer. I hope that you also have a game that makes you feel the way I felt with Final Fantasy VIII. Let me know in the comments the game that gives you happiness, the game that you continue to bring on your life's journey. Until next time, peace.